Hey guys, it's Crystal from Living Well with Crystal, and this week we are talking about weight, and specifically weight gain with gastroparesis and how to manage your weight. So first I want to say that even if this is not an issue that you are struggling with right now, if you are following a typical gastroparesis friendly diet that is high in refined carbohydrates, I really suggest that you watch the video anyway, because you're going to get some really good information that will help your overall health and well-being even if weight isn't a concern at this moment. Weight gain in gastroparesis is actually not uncommon. I would say that of all of the emails and the comments and the questions that I receive, of all of the people that I've worked with, it's probably about 50-50 when it comes to people who are asking me about gaining weight or the need to gain weight versus people who are asking me how they can lose weight. So it's really not uncommon to be struggling with either gaining weight after a gastroparesis diagnosis, an inability to lose weight with gastroparesis, or even just maintaining your weight in a range that is higher than you might expect or like or feel comfortable. Now, weight doesn't really have anything to do with gastroparesis symptoms or severity. I think that's a common misconception both among people with gastroparesis, certainly among kind of the general public, and even among healthcare providers, that if you are struggling with something like gastroparesis that causes a great deal of digestive distress, that limits the amount of food you can eat, that limits the variety of food that you can eat, that limits especially the fat, right? So if you're following the low fat diet, if you're eating small meals, many people would assume that you should and would be losing weight. Okay, so it's easy to look at somebody who is not losing weight, who may even be gaining weight, and think either their gastroparesis really must not be that bad, or they're lying about what they eat, or something like that, but none of that is true in most cases. What it really comes down to is what we call bio-individuality. So some people just respond differently to calorie restriction, to a low-fat diet, and to certainly the stress, physical and emotional, that gastroparesis places on a body. Just like in the real world, you probably know people who eat everything, right? They eat tons of food, all kinds of junk, and they're thin as a rail. And you probably know people who, if they look at a slice of cake, they seemingly gain weight, and they're constantly struggling with that. People respond to these things in different ways, and it's no different for people with gastroparesis. So that's kind of why you see this this wide range when it comes to weight issues and weight management with gastroparesis. It's not necessarily a reflection of the degree of delay or the severity of symptoms or the compliance with a low-fat diet or a comprehensive management plan. So I want to get that kind of out of the way first and foremost. Now, there are many theories for why people who are on a restricted diet like that with gastroparesis may not lose weight or may gain weight. The one that I want to talk about in particular today is something that has been getting a lot of attention in the media lately. It's something that I've been really interested in personally and certainly working on professionally for quite some time now, and that's actually the what we eat as opposed to the how much we eat. That's primarily in terms of carbohydrates and the kinds of carbohydrates and the quality of the carbohydrates in our diet, and the effect that that then has on our weight, our overall health. So I don't think it's any surprise that the typical or standard gastroparesis friendly diet is a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. And those carbohydrates tend to be refined, packaged, processed, empty. They're really easy to digest carbohydrates, which makes sense when we're thinking about trying to manage gastroparesis, but there are implications for our health and certainly our weight that we really need to take into account. And so there's a lot of science behind this. There are tons of studies that you can read. There are some good books I can recommend, but I'm going to try really hard to just boil everything down to super basic principles to make it easy to understand for the sake of conversation in this video, and so that I can then tell you how I think this relates to gastroparesis and what we can do about it. So basically, I want to talk about what happens when you eat these highly refined carbohydrates. When you eat carbohydrates, they are broken down into glucose or sugar, and that glucose is absorbed into your bloodstream. Glucose in our bloodstream doesn't do us any good. It needs to be in the cells of our body to provide energy. So when we eat carbohydrates, the glucose goes into our bloodstream. Our pancreas then secretes a hormone called insulin. And insulin's job is to basically take that glucose out of the bloodstream and move it into the cells where it can be used for energy. Now, foods that are really refined, processed, easy to digest, are absorbed very quickly, even in people with gastroparesis. So once your stomach does, digest the food, it goes very quickly into your bloodstream. And so the glucose level in your blood rises quite high, and your pancreas excretes a lot of insulin to gather up that glucose, get it out of the blood and into your cells. Now, when you're eating a lot of these really refined carbohydrates, your body can't always use that sugar immediately for fuel. And so the insulin then works to store it, and it stores the sugar as fat. And I think this is a really important thing to get, that it's not really fat that makes us fat, it's sugar. The sugar is turned to fat in our body, and so carbohydrates are converted to sugar, and then that is stored as fat. So even if you're not eating fat, you might wonder, how am I gaining fat? That's how. And so over time, this can lead to weight gain. There's also evidence that it leads to increased cholesterol, LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, increased triglycerides. So a lot of people with gastroparesis will actually find that their cholesterol goes up once they start eating a GP-friendly diet, if that diet is really high in refined carbohydrates. And it's really this insulin response that's likely the mechanism behind that. And so this can lead to insulin resistance, this can lead to heart disease. There's a lot of information coming out about the role that this constant secretion of insulin plays in our overall health. But getting back to weight, so if your diet is primarily refined carbohydrates, you're really releasing insulin, all day long. Every time you eat, your body probably isn't able to use all of that insulin for energy right away. It's being stored as fat. So it's not really just a calorie is a calorie. It's really about the kinds of calories that you're taking in. Now, eating a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet might also cause you to actually burn less calories, basically to slow your metabolism. There was a study that was done recently where they looked at 3 different diets, so a low-fat diet, a low glycemic index diet, and a high-protein diet, something similar to like Atkins. And the low-fat diet was actually 60% carbohydrates, 20% fat, and 20% protein. I can tell you from working with as many GPers as I have worked with, many of you are eating far more carbs than that, far less protein and far less fat. 80% carbs, 10% protein, 10% fat, maybe. So that's even more carbohydrates than was studied. But in this particular study, the people who followed the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet actually burned 300 less calories a day than the people who followed the low glycemic index diet or the high-protein diet. So you're actually burning less calories overall. And 300 calories a day, that's about an hour of pretty good intensity exercise. So that's also significant. Specifically for people with gastroparesis, all of these refined carbohydrates can actually exacerbate your symptoms. Even though we think of them as GP-friendly and we think of them as easy to digest, the majority of these are high in what we would call FODMAPs, right? So they're wheat-based. Even if you do not have celiac disease, you might be sensitive to these fermentable carbohydrates. Things like crackers, cereals, cookies, white bread, bagels, English muffins, all those kinds of things that tend to make up the staple of refined, easy to digest carbs. They can ferment in the gut, and they can exacerbate bloating, fullness, pain, all kinds of things that we associate with our GP. So without even realizing it, when we switch over from probably before gastroparesis a more well-balanced diet to a really heavy carb easily digested, highly refined, specifically carb diet, we may unknowingly be exacerbating these symptoms through these fermentable carbohydrates. So that's something else to consider, and that's another reason to think about reducing these kinds of carbohydrates in the diet. And so that kind of brings me to the what to do about it. So if the reason that some of us are gaining weight or not losing weight despite not eating very much at all is that we're eating primarily refined carbohydrates that are spiking that insulin all the time and therefore causing our bodies to store fat and burn fewer calories, what do we do about it? Well, there are kind of two things here. The first is to replace and reduce those refined carbohydrates. So if you think that I am a broken record when it comes to this, I kind of am, because it is so important for so many aspects of your health and well-being, and I don't want any of us to get into the position of compromising our overall health in the name of managing our gastroparesis symptoms, because as we know, again, a broken record on this, but dietary modification is not and should not be the only way that you strive to manage your gastroparesis symptoms. So if you are making dietary choices that are putting your overall and long-term health in jeopardy, I think it's really important to reevaluate that, and this is one of those areas. These refined carbohydrates are not health promoting, as we've talked about throughout this whole video, so we want to reduce those and replace those. Now, if you read a book like Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, which is actually a really good book if you want to understand the science behind this. There's a lot of information about the studies that have been done and where this theory comes from. But the recommendation for the diet is, pretty high fat, pretty high protein, pretty low carbohydrate. That's really not going to work for most people with gastroparesis. So then we have to kind of find the balance here, as we do with most things when it comes to gastroparesis. So I wouldn't recommend, drastically cutting those carbohydrates and replacing them all with protein. I would recommend striking more of a balance. And that's the second thing, is to increase your protein and increase your fat, both of those. Now, that might kind of sound frightening to some people, especially the fat part, because we know that fat slows digestion, and that's true for everybody, whether you have gastroparesis or not. Fat simply takes longer to break down in the stomach than carbohydrates. Fat is still an important nutrient. It's something that we need for overall health, for brain health, to absorb our fat-soluble vitamins. There's also a point at which reducing the fat in your diet no longer provides, extra symptom management benefits. And so most people do well between 25 to 30 and about 50 grams of fat a day. So if you're at the lower end, it might be worth seeing if you can replace some of those empty refined carbohydrates with a little bit more healthy fat. And that will make up the caloric difference as well. But it will give you calories that are not being stored as fat, that are actually being utilized by your body. We want to focus on the healthy fats, of course, things like coconut oil, olive oil, certainly nut butters. You guys know I'm a huge fan of nut butters, avocado, fatty fishes like salmon. So we're not talking about, donuts and cheeseburgers here, but healthy sources of fat in small amounts to gradually increase the amount of fat in your diet, and that can take the place of some of the refined carbohydrates. The other part of that is protein. Most gastroparesis-friendly diets are really low in protein. That's because protein can be difficult to digest, especially if you don't have enough stomach acid. So if you're on a high dose of, proton pump inhibitors, that can make animal protein in particular especially hard to digest. Things like eggs are a really good choice. Obviously, nut butters, again. Dairy products, some people do great with dairy, but they actually, again, those are high in FODMAPs. They can really exacerbate symptoms for a lot of people. Lean ground meats work really well for some people because they're obviously lean and they're ground, so it's a little bit less to digest. Things like chicken, turkey, obviously the breast, skinless. White fishes, even some of the fattier fishes work really well for a lot of people. So it's about finding a balance. And some people ask me, like, what's the ratio that I should be eating? And I think we can get a little bit too caught up in that as well, and I think that can stress us out. And I want to add no more stress to your gastroparesis management plan. Stress is horrible for gastroparesis. It is not GP friendly. And so I think when we try to adhere too tightly to those kinds of ratios and things like that that can further stress us out, I think the important thing to think about, especially when you're just getting started, is making sure that every meal or snack you eat contains carbohydrates, preferably not the refined empty packaged ones, hopefully things like fruits and vegetables, prepared in a GP-friendly way, of course. Things like, if you're going to do cereal, like a hot cereal, a whole grain hot cereal, something like quinoa flakes or brown rice, or a cream of buckwheat, something like that. Some people do really well with spelt instead of wheat, so like spelt toast. But so carbohydrates, some fat, and some protein. If you really focus on just getting a balance and making sure that each of your meals, every single time you eat, there is some fat and some protein, that will help start to automatically reduce those refined carbohydrates that you may be over consuming. So those are the two things: reduce and replace the refined carbohydrates, and increase the fat and the protein. So as you can see, it's not really about calories, it's not really about volume, and that should be obvious, right? To those of you who are struggling with this, you're not eating tons of excess calories. So it's really about the quality, and it's about the nutrients, and it's about the composition of what you're eating. Definitely check out the Brighter Side of Eating for Gastroparesis class. That will help a lot. It's about a 90-minute class, and I really go through, how to start implementing these kinds of changes way more than I can go through in this video. The important thing is for you to get the why this is so important, and how this might be contributing to weight issues. Now I want to say a quick word about exercise. The conventional wisdom is eat less, exercise more, and you'll lose weight. Well, if it were really just that simple, we really wouldn't have such an issue. So exercise, in order to burn a significant amount of calories, you have to exercise at a pretty good intensity for a pretty good amount of time. So like I said, if you're following a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet and you're burning 300 less calories a day than you were when you were maybe following a more balanced diet, to make up for those 300 calories and just kind of put you at a baseline, that's like an hour of pretty moderate, good intensity physical activity. So the amount of calories that you burn, especially when you're doing mild to moderate physical activity, which is recommended for the management of gastroparesis, really isn't that significant. What exercise does do, though, is first it can actually help with things like insulin resistance. It can help your body to utilize that glucose for fuel and store less as fat. And secondly, specifically for people with gastroparesis, it really does help with gastric emptying. It really does help alleviate symptoms like fullness and bloating, and may therefore allow you to eat more of these other foods to obtain this balance in your diet. So if you are incorporating regular physical activity, you might find that you're able to eat a more well-rounded, well-balanced diet, and that's obviously really important. That's what we're talking about here. So exercise certainly has a role, but it's not what most of us think of in terms of burning calories to lose weight. So again, all of this is my opinion based on what I've read and what I've studied and the people that I've worked with. And obviously, a lot of it comes down to bio-individuality. There are certainly people with gastroparesis who eat a very high carbohydrate, very low fat, low protein diet and do not gain weight, who have trouble maintaining their weight. That's how their body deals with the insulin. That's how their body deals with that kind of diet. Now you might notice that you kind of swing from one to the other, and that can change over time in terms of how your body adapts to deal with these kinds of things. But for those of you who are struggling with this weight issue, I hope that this might shed a little bit more light. I hope that this provides some information that we haven't really covered in the past. Like I said, the FAQ video that I did, that definitely talks about some really important things, some lifestyle and dietary choices, like lack of sleep and grazing and all those kinds of things that contribute to this as well. But the more I learn, the more I think this is a really important piece of the puzzle, both in terms of weight management and overall health. So this is something that I did want to share with you. I hope it makes sense. Like I said, I kind of really boiled it down into simple terms, but there's a lot more behind this. So if you're interested, I recommend doing the research. I recommend looking into it for yourself and educating yourself and empowering yourself to make the best choices that you can for your overall health and your GP management. So thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.